All right, so got done with like half an hour of working through the pipeline, which now you'll see is over here in the done category, because then I realized I hadn't recorded anything. So Catalan and I have been sitting here walking through this and digging through the problems and got it solved. So I'm just going to do kind of a quick walkthrough of what we discussed, what we did, what we found. We can go back through the PR and take a look at what was done. But one of the bigger things was I had mentioned there was usually a link over here. What I found out was it's actually off the screen, off the page, below the page fold is what it's called. This is an environment, and the actual thing I discussed here is the environment links to the actual deployments of your GitHub pages, which, this, if you look at the link down on the bottom there, Bob 4 on GitHub.io, how to take a test, is the proper link. However, what I actually see in enterprise environments where I'm currently working, this comes up with really weird stuff. Like the one that originally had been set up as was laughing broccoli with dashes in between, and then a series of numbers and letters after that, which I thought was really weird and kind of funny. But then last week it changed to something like automated broccoli. And having a discussion with somebody that's cloud-based, the conversation basically came along the lines of that it's actually pretty common for Docker containers, which we know GitHub uses Docker containers, to randomly assign a name if a name's not assigned. And in an enterprise environment, you can't say name of the company.github.io the same way you can. It makes it really easy for people to find your stuff. So if those Docker containers aren't given a fixed name, it sounds like it's randomly assigning the name. So what I've been trying to train our testers is, go to the repo, go to this environments, follow that to the deployment. Because if they're not doing that every time, they're going to go to a page that no longer exists at some point. And I don't know what the time frame would be when that would regenerate a new name. Okay, so we did get there, and we did get it actually working. It's pulling the code correctly. Now I want to kind of talk through how we got there. And Caitlin, if I start going too fast, let me know. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our pull request, and it's a closed pull request because we did finish it. And we're going to kind of take this backwards. Okay, because one of the things we can do is, I believe, is we can look at, this is one particular close of it. Let's go back to, this is 4 hours ago. That's too far back. 42 minutes ago, the pipeline adjustments. Okay, pipeline adjustments and the URL functions are two separate ones. And we'll take a look at these, the code that was applied here separately. And this is one commit and merge, so we can just look straight at the code changes that I was working out at the time. Okay, so one of the things I did was I changed our GitHub pages to, and let's zoom in just a little bit more. Our GitHub pages, and we can expand this up so you can see the whole thing if you want. The only adjustment made was we changed that to a build deploy, okay, in the build process. And we did the build deploy because in our packages file, our build deploy changed just slightly. And I think what we had this morning, I can't remember for sure, but I think it was -- base capital H href and a full URL. And this is the proper way to do it. I actually went and looked at one of my projects that works, tracked it down on what I thought was the previous recording to find it for this one. So I'm going to minimize that out. So we changed the deploy slightly to account for that. And then the other pieces of what I had to turn on the hash routing, what we had seen an error when it tried to go to home because it was actually looking for a home file on our path. And the hash route says, hey, this is a route, not a file. And this is one that I've had to do every time with GitHub pages. The difference in the demo code that we had looked at this morning is when he had built an Angular 15 project and pushed it up, he didn't have routing. And because he didn't have routing, that error wasn't seen. And this is one I've seen many, many times, and this is the fix for it. The other thing is I changed that fixed route of the base href in the HTML back to a single slash. And that build that we have in the package.json fixes that part. Okay. So what we saw when we merged these 4 file changes in was our page came up just right, as you would expect. However, one piece didn't work, and that was none of this showed up. We had list of grades in data file, and Catalan can verify he saw that, but we didn't see 3rd through 8th grade. Okay, and they weren't linkable. None of that was even visible. And when we looked, there was an error message, and the error message basically said that, hey, it's looking for assets at bob-fornal.github.io/assets. It was not accounting for the fact that we had a repo name in between. Okay. So what wound up having to happen there was we had to make another set of changes. And that is in the other closed pull request. Let's see if we can go back to that. And we built a getURL. We modified our getURL function. We did talk through this a little bit in what we were doing, but what Catalan saw us doing was I added local hosts and I added GitHub pages as keys and then objects. Okay. And most cases, you're going to have the same keys inside those, but the URLs are going to be different. So in the case of local host, we only want to go to /assets. In the case of the GitHub pages, we need to go to how to take a test assets, so on and so forth. Later on, when we have a production site, we might need a 3rd one to give the proper routing for that one. Okay. And then we need a way to identify which of those it is. And actually, when we first put these in, we triggered a huge error because endpoints needed modified, right? One of our typings, which originally was string : string key value. Okay. Well, this is no longer a string. It's an object with a string of strings, right? So we just had to nest in another name string inside that. Okay. So that was the first hurdle we had to get over. And that wasn't huge. I knew where it was as soon as I saw the error. Then let's not look at the tests first. Let's look at the code first. Then we had to modify getURL. And we went through a couple of minor iterations. And what Catalan saw me do was I took my local host version running, and let's actually spin it up so you can see. And we did some diagnostics to figure out exactly what we wanted to do, what commands were going to work best for us, and that kind of thing. And I mean, this is something I've done many times. It's not a big deal. But what I needed was the ability to determine which I wanted. So I wanted window.location. And I did search for how do I track my base URL. Okay, so what I want to know is localhost, or at least some portion of that, right? Get really close to that without having to look at the entire URL. And window location gives us a lot of things. And what we had was, as we went down this, we was able to see underneath it, which we, for whatever reason, can't see now. Let's see, can we narrow this down enough that it will push it somewhere else? Oops. No, it's going to get in our way no matter what we do. But what we narrowed it down to was, oh, look at that. If we go vertical above, that works really nicely. So let's do this. Let's push our command line way down. There we go. Okay, and I want to see host because that is actually what we wound up on. So what we were able to do was step through these and look at what we get, right? So value of is a function, toString is a function, search, so on and so forth. And okay, our protocol is HTTP, that doesn't matter. Our port is, our path name is. We have the origin. We have the href, which is the full route. We have host name and host, which are really pretty close. Host name is probably a little better, but host will work. Okay, and then I took that same command and we went to our environment and we did the same thing. And we said window, location, hrefs. I wanted to see what this looked like. Okay, well, href is what we want. We know that. So we guessed it was either host or host name. And host gives us what we need, and host name, it looks a lot alike. And host over here, the difference was the port was the only difference on it. Okay. We needed that because as we looked at our code, what we want to do is we want to take the window location host and see if it included, or host name, whichever we want to use, and look to see if it included GitHub IO. Because over here, if you looked at that host, it includes GitHub IO, which tells me I'm on a GitHub page, right? Because I'm on a GitHub page, we want to return the endpoints that are logged into GitHub pages based on that key inside it. In all other cases, at the moment, we want it to return the localhost key. So it tells us if we're localhost, use one route. If we're on GitHub pages, use another route. When we have our domain up and running and we're on there, we can actually put the domain in and have it use a domain version as well. So we can redirect to different places, depending on which environment our code is running in cleanly with this getURL function. Okay. And the other piece I added in was this underscore window, which seems a little odd to pass that window all the way through. And the explanation of that is pretty simple because I want to isolate. I wrote that in an awkward way, specifically to make it testable. Okay. Our original code had a single getURL checking to see if it had the correct URL. Well, I want to make two functions that are getURL return the correct URL for GitHub IO. And in this case, the endpoint key, or sorry, the key didn't matter too much. The endpoint had to change because we had to add GitHub pages in. So that our test URL is on GitHub pages, that key, and that should be the string we get. We can also create a mock window with a location host. So when it passes it into this code down here, it sees that GitHub IO on the window location host, and returns the GitHub pages version, which we've assigned it to GitHub pages, so we should get test URL back. If this weren't working right, we'd get an undefined back. Okay. And we also wrote a second unit test for expects getURL to return the correct URL for localhost. Again, we had to add a localhost key for us to look for. We had to modify our window to return localhost for down here. And then we just expect. The expects are the same on both of those. We did that slightly uglier code specifically to make it testable. Okay, these are things you kind of want to think through. It's a lot easier to mock and pass in window than it is to override window location. I mean, this is one of those things that makes developers nervous. You don't want to, in JavaScript, you can override just about anything. Unless I'm, well, there are very few cases you'd have to be holding a weapon to my head for me to want to override anything in JavaScript. Okay. And location would be one of those you want to be very, very careful of. All right. We overrode console log. That's about as deep as I'm going to get at overrides. This way, we don't have to override. We can mock and pass that in. Okay. So this is our first real type of a mock. Okay. So all this code together then allowed us to no longer have an error when our network tried to reach test JSON. So in this case, where we're live, we're on the GitHub pages. If we look at our test JSON route, it's the Bob Forno GitHub IO, how to take a test assets. So this portion here, how to take a test forward, came from that getURL, reaching in and saying, hey, you're on GitHub IO. If you're on GitHub IO, use how to take a test /assets as opposed to just /assets. In our local, our network, it's just a little bit different because we don't have that how to take a test before it. Okay, because it's all localhost, it picked a different route. It didn't have GitHub IO in the path, in the host. Okay. So that was the last set of changes there. We pushed that up. We saw it build. We saw it come out. And this is what we have. So we currently have a functional testing pipeline that protects our pull requests to make sure the unit tests are passing. We now have a build pipeline that builds to essentially at this point a dev environment. We're Catalin and I were talking about hosting. Wherever we end up hosting, one of the things we want to do is, we have this domain that we're going to point out there that's, where is it? Test Genius. And maybe we do something like dev.testgenius, test.devgenius. So that we have a dev environment that we can play in before we say for sure, yeah, we want to merge it over to the production version. We'll have to figure out how to pipeline that. I'm not 100% sure how I want to pipeline that at the moment, and we'll figure that out as we get there. We are going to want to consider how we do manual testing. But the big one we did was we added a card on here for discussion of hosting back in a database, right? So most of you are very familiar, as I was told, with which one?
Sorry, Mongo.
MongoDB, which it's a document database, right?
Yes, sir.
Which could serve our purposes reasonably well, but maybe we want to do a SQL database, even though it's a little bit harder, because I can show you a little bit of what happens in SQL databases. I'm familiar with them, but we need to look at where we host. It could be where you're familiar with. We need to keep the costs reasonable because I have to pay for this stuff long term. But we also need a place that's going to be easy for us to pipeline through the GitHub pages or GitHub Actions and that kind of stuff. Somewhere in there, I may talk with some of our automation folks and some of our CI/CD folks at Leading Edge and see if I can get some hints on how we can build some of these true dev, test, prod kind of setups, and how we tie in some automated testing, even if we have to use another service. And that may be the case there. We may need a service to host our changes. So one of the things that I've seen some places do is you can merge to dev all day long, but it takes some manual click to push a build from here to some location, and that triggers another process. Not quite sure how to do that with the GitHub Actions. That'll be a learning curve for all of us. Okay. And then we also added this service to maintain homepage selections, which I think we're going to need before the start page that we're going to build. Because the idea would be then the cards that Catalin built and that Dylan's building to select where you want to go, that data should get stored in that service so that when you navigate pages, we don't have to put it in the URL, that it gets stored in the service. And if we really want to get fancy, we could store it in like local host so that if they come back, short amount of time, that those data points stay. But I think there are a couple of things going on there that we still need to get straight. Did I cover everything?
I can't think of anything you didn't.
Okay. We broke it more than we fixed it, but we did get it working eventually. I think Catalin at one point had made some comment about, I love it when GitHub trips up even senior developers, and it trips them up more often than not. I told you guys early on in the earlier session that it never works the first time. GitHub Actions clearly never work the first time. I was hoping this time it might, not even close. Okay. This is common. All right. So unless you got anything else, I think we're done.
Nothing for the video.
All right.